I was at a housewarming party last week for a friend of mine. He'd just bought his first home.
Oh, that's a big step.
Huge. And he was just obsessing over security. He gave me this whole 20-minute tour of his new alarm system, the motion sensor floodlights.
The works.
The works. And he was planning to install this reinforced fencing. He was speaking with this intense primal protectiveness, practically vibrating with the need to define his territory.
I can picture it.
He sounded like a Roman citizen describing his absolute dominium. This idea that this land was his and his alone to control and defend against the entire world.
Right.
But then later in the evening, we decided to watch a movie.
Okay.
And without missing a beat, he pulls up his laptop and loads a pirated stream of a film that's still in theaters.
The plot thickens.
Exactly. So I jokingly mentioned he was stealing it, and that fierce defender of property rights, he just vanished. He shrugged, totally relaxed, and said, "It's just a file, man. It's not like I took the physical DVD."
That is a perfect example.
That instantaneous shift was fascinating to watch. In 1 hour, he went from embodying this ancient, rigid enforcement of physical boundaries, where ownership is about survival and power, to this completely fluid, almost dismissive attitude toward intangible assets.
He was acting out the central conflict of modern property law in his living room.
He really was. And it made me think, how did we get here? How did we get from a world where property was purely about land and lineage to a world where we're trying to place fences around ideas? To understand that disconnect, I think we have to go back to the beginning.
We do. And that tension you observed, it really encapsulates the mission of this deep dive. We're exploring that exact core tension, how the very concept of what is mine has evolved over, 2 millennia.
From that primal Roman idea.
Exactly. From rigidly protecting physical territory and lineage embodied by that concept of absolute ownership to a world where we have this fluid, almost dismissive attitude toward a pirated film file.
So the old rules just don't apply.
They don't.
Yeah.
And that's the central challenge for modern jurisprudence. The legal foundations that were established for physical property land, cows, houses, they just do not map cleanly onto files, algorithms, and lines of code.
It's a completely different universe of assets.
It is. So today we're exploring how the definition of mine has changed, moving from that single absolute concept to a fragmented, contested legal landscape. We're examining the very foundations of ownership itself. This journey is about tracing the philosophy and the legal architecture that dictates who gets to control what and why.
Okay, so let's start with those foundational pillars. You mentioned that primal protectiveness my friend had. That's the Roman concept of dominium, right? It feels so fundamental, so complete.
It's the foundational pillar, and it's so crucial to understand just how absolute it was. Dominium represented the complete, absolute, and exclusive legal right over a physical thing.
So it wasn't just about, say, living on the land.
Oh no, it was much more than just use or possession. It included the right to enjoy the fruits of the property, the fructus. It included the right to use it, the usus.
And crucially,
the right to alienate or even destroy the property, the abuses.
Destroy it! Wow.
Yes. If you had dominium over a piece of land, your control extended infinitely upward into the sky and downward into the earth. It was a singular, indivisible, overarching power.
That's an incredible amount of control.
It is. And this powerful concept is what shaped all subsequent property law, especially in the civil law traditions you see across much of Europe today.
So it's not just a historical curiosity.
Not at all. The remarkable thing is that Roman law isn't just a historical footnote. It's what you could call a living repository. It provides an architectural blueprint that continues to structure modern legal systems. It has this profound and lasting influence, even informing our understanding of things like liability and commercial agreements today.
I find it fascinating how far back that blueprint goes, and yet how structurally rigorous it was. What were the core pieces of that architecture that still resonate?
Well, the Romans gave us these rigorous categorical distinctions that we still use to organize law. The most enduring influence is probably their tripartite division. They divided all law into 3 primary branches.
Okay.
First, you have ius publicum. This regulates the nuanced interplay between the state and the citizenry.
So like constitutional law.
Exactly. It's essentially the constitutional law of the empire dealing with public administration, criminal justice, the mechanisms of government. In modern terms, this branch molds the constitutional constructs of nation-states, governing everything from elections to taxation.
Its focus is on the collective, on public order.
Precisely. maintaining public order and safeguarding citizen rights and freedoms against the state itself.
Okay, so that's the state versus the people. What's the second branch?
Then you have ius privatum. This governs legal relations that emerge between individual and individual, or between legal entities in a private capacity.
This is where property rights would live.
This is exactly where they live.
Yeah.
This branch was absolutely essential in shaping modern civil law systems. It offered a sophisticated way to navigate interpersonal rights and duties. It meticulously defined property rights, contractual agreements, rules of succession, family law.
So all the rules for trade, wealth, disputes between private citizens.
You got it. It's focused squarely on safeguarding private interests.
And the third one was immanus gentium, the law of nations. That sounds very modern, almost like the precursor to globalization.
It is the intellectual precursor to modern international law. And your point about commerce is key. As Rome's commerce exploded, immanus gentium emerged as this legal edifice, a set of norms and regulations for international exchange.
This was for dealing with non-Romans, right?
Exactly. It was especially for dealing with non-Roman foreigners, the peregrini, because those individuals weren't covered by the strict rules of immus civil, which applied only to Roman citizens. You needed a common set of rules.
So you could trade with anyone, basically.
Right. And this construct evolved to buttress the intricate tapestry of modern international law and its commercial protocols. It was seminal in elevating universally applicable norms, regulating relations among diverse nationalities, dealing with things like diplomatic immunities, trade restrictions, maritime law.
It showed an early understanding that for different groups to interact, you need a shared rule book.
A generalized system of accepted rules. It was absolutely necessary for stability and for a functioning economy.
So that brings us from these ancient, rigorous legal systems to the Enlightenment. This is where thinkers really tried to codify the moral arguments for and against private ownership, right? Setting the stage for every political economy that followed.
Absolutely. If Rome gave us the legal blueprint for what property is, the philosophers gave us the moral justification for why it should even exist.
And we have to start with John Locke.
We do. Locke established this hugely influential individualistic right to property. He asserted that property rights are not granted by the state, but actually preceded.
So it's a natural right, not a social one.
A natural, pre-existing right that is innate and inalienable. For Locke, the entire purpose of government is fundamentally the preservation of this natural right.
Okay, so how did he get from that abstract idea of a natural right to owning, say, a specific piece of land? It wasn't just handed down from on high.
No, it comes through his potent labor theory of property. Locke traces the origin of property to one's undeniable ownership over their own physical person and their labor. He says every man has a property in his own person.
Okay, that makes sense. I own myself.
Right. And from this original undeniable self-ownership, your labor, the physical action that constitutes the work of one's own hands, that acts as the mechanism.
So when I work on something...
When a person mixes their labor with raw, natural material that is initially common to all, that labor converts the resource into their private property.
So you're mixing yourself, your effort, with the common resource. And that fixes within it something that is unequivocally yours. It separates it from the common state.
Exactly. This exertion removes the object of his labor from the common state nature placed it in, annexing it as his own. And crucially, Locke argued this conversion happens without needing the assignation or consent of anybody.
You don't need anyone's permission.
No. Labor itself endows property with its legitimacy, making the individual the original sovereign over that material.
But even for Locke, these property rights weren't meant to be, an absolute free-for-all. He did establish some important moral limitations on that right.
He did, and these limitations, or provisos as they're called, are often forgotten, but they were critical to his original moral argument.
What were they?
The first is the waste proviso. You should only appropriate as much as you can use before it spoils.
Don't take more than you need, basically.
Right. And the second, which is perhaps more contentious, is the sufficiency proviso. Ownership is only justified so long as there is still enough and as good left for others.
Okay, so don't hoard resources everyone needs.
That was the idea. But the subsequent interpretation, and frankly, the ignoring of these provisos, is what fueled the massive industrial accumulation that followed in Western economies.
How so?
Well, once money was introduced, Locke argued the waste proviso became largely irrelevant because money doesn't spoil, so you can justify accumulation. And the sufficiency proviso was often warped to suggest that any appropriation that improved the land, making it more economically productive, actually benefited everyone, even if it reduced the amount of common land available.
That's a critical transition. So Locke provides the philosophical basis for market capitalism and economic individualism, but those limitations he set were often just overlooked in practice.
Absolutely. The Lockean model prioritizes the individual effort and views the state as secondary, as a protective shield for pre-existing rights.
So then how did thinkers like Jean-Jacques Rousseau look at that Lockean individualist framework and argue, wait a minute, that's inherently dangerous?
Rousseau presents a fundamental direct critique. He focuses on the relational obligation. For him, property is fundamentally contingent. It is not a natural right that precedes society. It is a right granted by society.
Not born with it, but given it.
Precisely. Rousseau famously observes that the first person who fenced off a plot of land and declared, "This is mine," was the true founder of civil society. But he meant this ironically as a kind of original sin.
Right. Because for him, the physical act of enclosure through labor isn't enough.
It's not nearly enough. Its legitimacy requires the common agreement and consent of others.
So if I build a fence, that fence is useless unless the community around me agrees to recognize and defend my exclusion of others from that land.
Precisely. If others remain free to reject or misunderstand the appropriation, the proprietary right remains unstable or contingent. The very act of appropriation signifies a lack of self-sufficiency. It implies a movement toward others and ties the individual inextricably to the community.
That relational aspect is the key difference from Locke's radical individualism.
It's the whole game. And because property rights require common consent, they are inherently subordinate to the sovereign or the community.
The general will.
The general will, yes. The fundamental social contract requires citizens to alienate their rights and belongings to the community they enact. Therefore, individual property rights are subordinate to the supreme power of the sovereign. Rousseau's goal was to ensure equal access to property, or at least minimize inequality, to promote equal political participation.
Rather than letting property just atomize society into a bunch of individuals defending their own stuff.
Exactly. Motivating citizens to uphold common laws, not just engage in a purely defensive struggle.
So we have Locke. Property is natural, absolute, based on individual labor, and the state's job is to protect it. And we have Rousseau. Property is a societal grant, contingent on community consent, and subordinate to the general will. This philosophical tension is really the foundation for everything we see today.
It really is.
And this is where those philosophical seeds blossom into concrete legal architecture. We can see Locke and Rousseau's ideas play out so clearly in two major modern legal systems dealing with physical assets, like land, the US and Germany.
The contrast is stark, and it really shows a direct lineage from those philosophical roots you just laid out.
So let's start with the US approach. It seems like a direct descendant of Locke's theory.
It's a direct and robust descendant. It prioritizes economic individualism and views property as a shield against the state. The focus, particularly in constitutional jurisprudence around land, is the protection of economic impact and safeguarding what they call investment-backed expectations.
The American system is designed to secure a market-based capitalist social order.
Absolutely. And the U.S. Constitution emphasizes property protection, viewing it primarily as a negative guarantee, a command to the government not to interfere without due process or compensation.
So the system has also moved far beyond that old Roman concept of a single absolute dominium. Instead, property is conceptualized using the famous bundle of sticks metaphor.
Right. And that's a crucial shift.
Can you elaborate on that? Why did property become a bundle rather than a single thing?
Well, the bundle of sticks reflects the legal realization that property ownership isn't a single monolithic relationship to a physical thing. It's actually a collection of abstract rights that are recognized and enforced by the government.
What kind of rights are in the bundle?
Things like the right to possess, the right to use, the right to exclude others, the right to dispose of it, and the right to its fruits. And these rights could be separated, sold, or regulated independently.
Which became necessary as society got more complex.
Exactly. As society industrialized, property became more complex. You might separate mineral rights from surface rights or grant an easement for a utility line. So in the U.S. system, although destroying only one stick from the bundle is generally not a taking, the entire analysis is results-oriented. It focuses overwhelmingly on the economic injury to the landowner when the state intervenes.
And the constitutional tool for this protection is the takings clause of the Fifth Amendment. Originally, that was just about physical seizure, wasn't it?
Yes, initially. The clause reads, "Nor shall private property be taken for public use without just compensation." And for a long time, this was interpreted very literally. The government had to physically occupy or seize your land eminent domain to trigger compensation.
But that changed.
It changed in a massive way with the 1922 case Pennsylvania Colco v. Mahon. This established the concept of the regulatory taking.
Meaning the government doesn't have to physically take your land to owe you money.
Precisely. The Supreme Court recognized that a government restriction without any physical occupation could trigger a Fifth Amendment right to compensation if the regulation went too far, if it effectively destroyed the property's economically viable use.
And that, of course, set the stage for decades of litigation trying to figure out how far is too far.
Exactly. So to manage this ambiguity, the Supreme Court developed factors to determine when a regulation crosses that line, the most famous being the Penn Central Test.
Right, from the 1978 case. This is the three-factor inquiry they still use, correct?
It is. It's a fact-intensive inquiry, and courts look at three primary considerations. First, the economic impact of the regulation on the claimant. Is the owner left with a total or near-total destruction of the property's value?
So how much money did you lose?
Pretty much. Second, the extent to which the regulation has interfered with distinct investment-backed expectations.
Meaning, did you reasonably rely on the law as it was when you bought or invested in the property?
That's the one. And third, the character of the government action. Is the regulation something akin to a physical invasion? Or is it merely an adjustment of economic burdens to promote the general welfare, like preventing a public nuisance?
That focus on investment-backed expectations just screams Lockean individualism. It elevates the economic potential of the land above almost all other considerations.
It really does. While courts acknowledge that the state must have the power to regulate for health and safety, zoning to prevent industrial plants next to schools, or restricting land use to prevent pollution, any regulation that severely restricts the potential return on an investment is viewed very skeptically.
The economic injury is the key.
The existence of significant economic injury is considered indispensable to demonstrating a regulatory taking. U.S. law is fundamentally dedicated to protecting material worth and the potential for maximizing profit.
Okay, so now let's contrast that defensive economic shield with the German system, which seems to absorb the spirit of Rousseau's relational obligation. The German Grundgesetz, or Basic Law, was adopted right after World War II, and it reflects a fundamentally different social contract.
That post-war history is absolutely critical. The German legal system is rooted in the concept of the social welfare state, and it seeks to balance individual rights with robust community interests.
And the core difference is codified right in their property clause, Article 14.
It is. Article 14.2 states this affirmative duty, the Sozialpflicht. Property entails obligations. Its use should also serve the public interest.
That's not a suggestion. That's a legally binding statement.
It's a legally binding statement that property ownership is inherently tied to the community's well-being. It's not just a limitation on a pre-existing right, like in the U.S. It's an affirmative duty to ensure property fulfills a social function.
So property ownership is viewed not just as an individual economic right, but as a form of participation in the social order.
Exactly. The German state is explicitly authorized to pursue a socially just property order by balancing individual freedom against the general welfare. But that doesn't mean the property guarantee is toothless. It's limited by a constitutionally guaranteed sphere of rights known as the Kernbereich, the core field.
And this Kernbereich is where the owner's individual autonomy and dignity are protected, even against that general will.
That's right. The Federal Constitutional Court focuses on what the legislature cannot regulate away. And this core protection is tied primarily to the owner's personal freedom and dignity. It's about ensuring the owner can maintain the ability to use the property as a base for their autonomous life.
Rather than just maximizing its economic yield.
Exactly. Any regulation that completely removes the possibility of personal use or enjoyment risks infringing this core field.
This sounds like a fundamentally different way to approach compensation for state regulation.
It is. German courts distinguish between two types of interventions. The first is Eigentumsbindung, which means defining the content of property. This dictates the scope and acceptable uses of property, and it's usually non-compensable because it's seen as fulfilling the constitutional purpose of property itself.
And the second type.
The second is Enteigning, or expropriation. This is a taking. It happens when the state targets a specific individual's property for a specific public purpose, and that requires compensation.
We can see this in how they handle complex urban planning and land use regulations, like something called Mollendumlegung.
That is a perfect example of social plicht in action. Ballendum legum is a crucial zoning tool in urban planning. It allows local authorities to reorganize or even relocate developed and undeveloped plots within a designated area.
Why would they do that?
To ensure orderly development, create public spaces, and open up land for new construction.
So why would a German landowner accept having their plot relocated without demanding compensation? That would be unthinkable in a U.S. regulatory taking case.
Because the Federal Constitutional Court reasoned that this process was non-compensable. Its primary purpose was not to deny the owner their core rights, but to reconcile private interests and facilitate development for all owners within that jurisdiction.
So because it fulfills the constitutional purpose of protecting property by ensuring orderly social development, it falls under the owner's non-compensable social obligation.
Exactly. The courts emphasize that property protection guarantees freedom, not the right to exploit every potential economic use. The German system prioritizes the guarantee of property as a foundation for personal freedom and civic duty, a Republican ideal, over the Lockean dedication to maximizing economic potential.
So we've seen how challenging it is to draw fences around physical land in the modern world, especially when comparing the Lockean focus on economic loss in the U.S. versus the Rousseauian social obligation in Germany. Now we need to trace the journey of trying to place fences around the intangible, around ideas. The fundamental question shifts from who controls the dirt to who controls the copy.
And the moment the concept of copying became easy and desirable, the fight began. That high-stakes legal precedent starts way back in 6th century Ireland with the tale of the two monks, Columba and Finian.
Right. This predates formal copyright by a millennium, but it showcases that immediate, visceral importance of ownership over a copied work.
It does. Columba borrowed Finian's Psalter, the original manuscript, and then proceeded to secretly, illegally copy the text. This unauthorized reproduction led to a legal dispute that went all the way to the High King Diarmaid.
And the king's ruling, the judgment of the calf, was so illustrative of early property concepts, wasn't it? It was all derived from the agricultural world.
Completely. He said, "To every cow belongs her calf, therefore to every book belongs its copy."
It's so fascinating because the right isn't based on creative effort. It's not about the work of writing or translating.
Not at all. It's based on the physical medium. The king treated the copy as an appendage of the physical original manuscript, just like a calf is an appendage of the cow. The owner of the original source material was deemed the owner of the physical copy made from it.
And it established an early, if bloody, precedent.
Very bloody. Because Columba refused to surrender the copy, provoking an armed conflict that tragically led to the death of thousands of men.
All over control of a copy. It shows that even back then, information held tremendous value and power.
And people were willing to go to war over who could control its physical distribution.
Which brings us to the next technological leap that forced legal evolution. The printing press in the 15th century. If monks copying by hand created conflict, mass printing created a full-blown economic revolution.
The printing press allowed for the widespread dissemination of ideas, sure, but it also created the threat of rampant unauthorized copying, and it required massive capital investment.
So the authorities needed to control the flow of information and protect the financial investment of the printers.
Right, and they regulated this through a system of privileges. These are basically monopolies granted to specific printers or guilds, like the Stationers' Company in England, to control what material could be circulated and for how long.
So the economic benefit went entirely to the publishers who held the privilege, not the authors who did the creative work. It was a trade regulation, not an author's right.
Exactly. It was a cartel system. The Stationers' Company traded permits among themselves, essentially turning an administrative license into a perpetual right to copy a book. Authors got virtually no direct benefit or control after the initial sale of their manuscript.
But the monumental shift that broke this monopoly and finally centered the creator came in 1710 with the Statute of Anne.
That act is universally recognized as the birth of modern copyright law. It transferred the right to authorized reproduction away from those private monopolies and vested copyright with the authors, the professional writers and creators.
But only for a limited time.
For a limited time, yes. 14 years, renewable once if the author was still alive. This was a critical step in acknowledging the economic and professional status of writers, shifting the legal focus from protecting the printer's investment to rewarding the author's intellectual creation.
And it intentionally established a fundamental balance that persists in copyright law today.
Yes, it did. The Statute of Anne sought to balance the private interests of authors with the public's need to access knowledge. By limiting the term of protection, it ensured works would eventually enter the public domain.
It also had a public access component, didn't it?
It did. It made the deposit of newly published books in various libraries mandatory, which facilitated public access to information and ensured the spread of learning. This foundational concept, limited exclusive rights balanced against public benefit, is the core principle of copyright.
And this principle of balance carried through into international standardization, most notably with the Berne Convention in 1886.
The Berne Convention formalized copyright as an internationally recognized property right. It introduced the requirement of automatic protection, meaning authors didn't need to register their work or use a copyright symbol in member countries to be protected.
And crucially, it introduced the concept of originality as the starting point for protection.
That's the key. It set the standard that international copyright law continues to uphold today, requiring that the work be the author's own intellectual creation, reflecting their personality, imagination, and free choice.
Speaking of global influence, we should look at how nations outside the Western tradition handled this, particularly China, given its massive commercial importance today.
Right. Historically, China had a very distinct tradition. Cultural values emphasized communal knowledge sharing. Ideas were often viewed as collective assets that stemmed from the collective good, which naturally contrasted with the individualistic property rights concepts established in the West.
But rapid economic growth and global integration necessitated a robust change to its legal framework.
Indeed. Following significant economic reforms in the late 20th century, China began strengthening its intellectual property framework to support innovation and attract foreign investment. A major milestone was the enactment of the Patent Law of 1984, which introduced formal patent protections.
And that was just the beginning.
It was. The law was amended multiple times to align more closely with international technical standards and legal requirements, demonstrating a strong commitment to establishing a modern IP system.
And the definitive turning point was accessing the World Trade Organization.
Correct. China's accession to the WTO in 2001 marked a major, deliberate commitment to complying with international IP agreements, specifically the TRIPS agreement. This solidified its modern legal framework, ensuring strong enforcement mechanisms and reflecting a successful integration of intellectual property law to support a complex, globalized economy.
The goal being to protect both domestic and international creation.
Exactly, to foster an environment conducive to technological advancement and trade.
So we've traveled from absolute ownership of physical land through the philosophical arguments and tracked the high-stakes fight to fence off ideas. But technology always forces the law to evolve, and nothing is challenging the core definitions of property and authorship like generative AI.
This brings us right back to your friend in the pirated film as just a file. The digital fence is now being challenged not just by copying, but by machine creativity.
So let's talk about the technology and the legal problem it creates. Generative AI models are producing content that is astonishingly close to human creations.
They are. This technology is a specialized, advanced branch of deep learning that leverages neural networks to process massive data sets and create entirely new outputs based on patterns and probabilities.
And understanding how they create is essential to understanding the legal conflict. For text generation like ChatGPT, we're talking about transformer models.
Right. Transformer models are adept at processing sequential data. They operate by relying on a mechanism called attention, which lets them weigh the significance of different words in an input when generating an output. They basically function by predicting the next most probable word in a sequence.
So where does the creativity come from?
It's often managed algorithmically. The output is composed of highly ranked words, those statistically most likely to follow. But a significant percentage, often around 20%, are lower ranked words introduced randomly or semi-randomly. This slight randomness ensures that even the exact same prompt yields different results, mimicking human variation but stemming from a statistical calculation, not intent.
And for visual output, we see diffusion models like Midjourney.
Diffusion models approach creation differently. They're trained in two phases. First, they learn to corrupt data taking a clear image and progressively adding noise until it's completely random.
And then they learn to reverse it.
Exactly. They learn the denoising process. So when a user provides a textual prompt, like a futuristic cityscape at sunset, the model starts with pure noise and then uses that learned denoising process guided by the text to generate a coherent, original visual sample.
And the conflict here is clear. Traditional copyright law is fundamentally anthropocentric. It's human-centered.
It's entirely human-centered. Copyright law requires originality derived from human authorship or intellectual creation. Protection is limited to the original products of the human mind, fixed in a tangible medium.
And generative AI challenges this because the machine is controlling the execution phase. If the human input is just a prompt, is that enough intellectual creation?
That's the million-dollar question. The problem is that the machine isn't just a tool, like a paintbrush or a camera. It's making millions of creative, probabilistic decisions that the user cannot anticipate or control. This makes it incredibly difficult to trace human originality in the classic personality-driven sense.
So how are legal systems dealing with this? Both the US and EU seem to be holding a firm line, insisting that human authorship is non-negotiable.
They are. The standard across both jurisdictions adheres to that Berne Convention principle. Works must be the author's own intellectual creation. This creation is meant to reflect the author's personality through the exercise of free and creative choices.
So if the creation is just driven by an algorithm, it's not original?
Exactly. If it's influenced overwhelmingly by technical constraints or algorithms, originality is absent and protection is denied. AI-generated works that lack a demonstrable human creative choice are therefore denied protection.
The U.S. Copyright Office has been very explicit about this, especially in that highly publicized Zarya of the Dawn comic book case.
That case provided crucial clarity. The creator, Kristina Kashnova, used Midjourney to generate the images for her comic. The U.S. Copyright Office confirmed that the AI-generated artwork itself, the raw images produced by the machine, was not copyrightable.
And their reasoning was?
Their reasoning was that machine output lacks the human authorship requirement. The Copyright Office argued that the user doesn't have sufficient control over the specific aesthetic or outcome generated by the diffusion model.
But the work wasn't entirely denied protection. The human input was salvaged.
That's the key legal distinction. The Copyright Office did register the human elements. The creative selection, the arrangement of the panels on the page, the visual juxtaposition of the images to tell a story, and the accompanying text.
So the curation was copyrightable, but the images were not.
Exactly. The message is clear. Using the technology is fine, but the human contribution must amount to an original work of authorship, especially in terms of artistic control and final arrangement. The EU perspective aligns with this. They see AI as dominating the execution phase, while humans remain vital for the conception and redaction phases.
The UK, however, takes a unique, almost pioneering stance. They've established a specific legal mechanism for works where a human author, by traditional standards, might be absent.
They have. The UK Copyright Act of 1988, in Section 9.3, explicitly includes provisions for computer-generated works, where there is no human author of the kind traditionally required. This provision is a global outlier. It's a legal fiction, a deliberate workaround to address technological advancement.
And the legal fiction is that copyright vests in the person by whom the arrangements necessary for the creation of the work are undertaken.
Yes. This acknowledges that the machine itself can't hold rights, so it grants the rights to a human proxy, the orchestrator. This provision also grants a much shorter protection term of only 50 years, acknowledging the unique nature of these works.
But that seems to introduce a huge amount of ambiguity. Who exactly is the person making the necessary arrangements? Is it the programmer who designed the algorithm or the end user who types in the prompt?
That is the core challenge. The law fails to provide clear guidance, and it leads to deep legal insecurity. Necessary arrangements could be interpreted broadly, from the engineers who train the model to the company providing the service, or the individual user who spent 5 seconds typing a prompt.
So where is the thinking leaning?
The prevailing view in the UK is leaning toward the user, as they are the one deciding to generate the work and putting it into commercial circulation. But it's still very much an open question.
And this provision has often been likened to the work-for-hire doctrine in the US, where the employee who creates something doesn't own the copyright, but the employer who hired them does.
In principle, it is very similar. The ultimate legal author is not the physical or mechanical creator, but the hiring or facilitating party. However, it's important to note this system in the UK only applies to economic rights. The machine-generated work receives no moral rights protection, like the right of paternity or integrity.
Which further emphasizes its status as a commercial legal fiction rather than a true intellectual creation.
Exactly.
So, given the legal insecurity in the UK and the limited protection in the US and EU for these machine-executed elements, what is the most reasonable and practical solution moving forward? We need a system that incentivizes innovation while providing legal clarity.
Well, a strong argument exists that vesting rights in the end user of the generative program is the most pragmatic solution.
Why the user?
Because this approach aligns with the fundamental incentive structure that copyright law is supposed to support, promoting the progress of arts and science by granting limited monopoly rights.
What's the rationale for viewing the user as the optimal copyright holder, even if their involvement seems so minimal?
There are a few compelling legal and commercial points. First, the user is ultimately the one who decides to fix the outcome. They select the final result, satisfying that core copyright requirement that the work be expressed in a tangible medium. Even if the machine does the execution, the user provides the final act of selection and preservation.
Okay, that makes sense.
Second, the user is the one who enriches the raw output and adds commercial value. They apply their judgment, they refine the prompt, often over many iterations, and they put the work to use in the marketplace. That commercialization step is critical for economic growth.
And this framework also leverages an existing legal approach, which would reduce novelty and therefore the risk of litigation.
It does. Allocating rights to a person not directly involved in the mechanical creative effort is the whole basis for the work-for-hire doctrine. Legal scholars argue that giving rights to the user is the solution least likely to lead to litigation, which prevents legal uncertainty that could hinder the progress of technology.
Because if the user isn't protected, the work just falls into the public domain immediately.
And that removes the necessary economic incentive for production and dissemination. It could lead to chaos or potentially to users misrepresenting authorship just to secure protection.
So the practical reality is, if an AI output is going to be protected economically, the user is the best candidate for ownership.
They are the instrument of fixation, the agent of enrichment, and the commercializing party. This approach focuses on the commercial reality of the asset, much like how the U.S. analyzes economic impact and physical property disputes. It provides a functional, if imperfect, fence around these new digital files.
So to wrap this all up,
The entire journey from that Roman concept of physical dominium, the absolute right to define and defend territory, all the way to the contested legal ground of digital property, it demonstrates a continuous struggle. A struggle between two fundamental philosophical impulses.
the Lockean and the Rousseauian.
It is the Lockean impulse to protect the individual's effort and economic expectation, which remains so dominant in U.S. constitutional law. That impulse ensures that an individual's accumulated economic value is shielded from state interference.
But balanced against that,
Balanced against that is the Rousseauian impulse to acknowledge the broader communal context and social obligation required for property to even exist and have value. That's the standard we see codified in the German Grundgesetz's emphasis on Sozialpflicht and the protection of dignity over maximum economic return.
So whether we're fencing off a field or fencing off an algorithm's output, the definition of property remains fundamentally contingent. It depends entirely on whose labor is recognized. Is it the physical effort of a peasant mixing his hands with the soil, or the abstract effort of a user refining a prompt?
And it depends on whose consent is granted by the community.
The ancient king's consent for the copied psalter, or the modern Copyright Office's consent for a curated AI image. The rules of engagement are still being written in real time by courts trying to maintain that ancient balance between safeguarding individual rights and promoting the general societal good.
Especially as the lines between human creation and mere technical execution blur into invisibility.
The shift from tangible boundaries to these fluid digital fences is complete, but the fundamental struggle for the definition of mine endures.